everyone, and welcome to the 22nd International Literature Festival here in Berlin. I'm so happy to see you all. I know there's a lot of very interesting things and events competing for your attention, so we especially appreciate that you're here. My name is Zara Rahman. It's my honor to be here tonight with Maaza Mengiste. She's a Booker Prize finalist, author of 2 novels, Beneath the Lion's Gaze and The Shadow King. So we'll be talking about The Shadow King today. In addition to her novels and the many awards that she's received, she's also the initiator of Project 3541, which is an archive of the 1935 to 1941 war between Ethiopia and Italy. So we'll be talking about the project and The Shadow King. Please give her a warm welcome. So we'll be talking about a range of things this evening, writing, memory, archives, the act of remembering through your book and through your project. I wondered if to start us off you could do a short reading from your book just to ground us all, help us arrive in the moment.
Absolutely. And thank you all for coming here. I know it's late,
Yeah.
but I love that we're spending these late hours with literature. Thank you. Aster is a glorious figure astride her horse, Bunna. She has loosened her braids, and thick strands of hair fall against her neck and spread like a dark curtain around her sunlit face. She snaps the animal to a trot across the crest of the hill, her cape fanning around her figure, the golden clasp trapping flints of afternoon light. "Women," she shouts. "Sisters, are you listening to me?" Her voice rises into the sky, a blade slicing through the valley below, startling the women from their tasks, forcing them to lift their heads and turn in her direction. "Sisters, are you ready for what's to come?" Ethiopia's gifted Asmari will sing of this day for years, of how the women drop their baskets and their jugs, how they push away their looms and piles of wool. They rise to their feet nearly in unison, unaware of their own glory, and lift their faces toward Aster's voice. That they pause long enough to listen to the soft tap of distant gunfire is a detail that the songs will repeat again and again. The musicians will make of the women's frowns a forewarning of what's to come. The singers will use the women's gasps and exclamations as signs of their growing strength. One Asmari after the next will sing these words as they play their masinko. That first battle cry was already forming in the women's throats. Aster knew she just needed a way to usher it out. The women were ready but did not know it. There were bullets to be made and gunpowder to mix and rifles to load and enemies to shoot. "Women, those who can make bullets, come to me." Aster's voice carries across the valley before breaking into echoes and scattering into the horizon. She is one woman. She is many women. She is all the sound that exists in the world. And I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I remember the first time I read the book, that paragraph stood out to me so much. So it's so amazing to have you read it for us.
Thank you.
I guess just to start with kind of an obvious question, the role of women in history, in wars especially, is often left unwritten or unsaid. But in this book, you really foreground the stories of the women in all of their complexity. Could you talk about where the inspiration came to kind of switch that narrative to go into the women's role more than here?
Yes. I have to admit that when I was starting this book, I didn't know about the women at all. And in fact, my intent had been to create a story that was based around the stories that I heard growing up, which were often of people in my family who were the men who rose up. The story was always the same. They rose up to fight the Italians. They didn't have enough weapons, and then somehow Ethiopians won. For a child, that story could take on the proportions of myth or legend. It was for me like a fairy tale. As I grew older, I began to ask questions, though, of what does it mean to be at war? What does it mean to fight for 5 years? If victory is declared, does war actually end for an individual or for a community? What does it mean to end a war? And those were the questions that guided me into the research and into this book. But really, the story of women came quite by accident. And it came from speaking to a child. He wasn't a child, he was at this point a grown man, an elder, an Italian, whose father had been a pilot in Ethiopia. And I spoke to this man in a small town in Italy, in Calabria. And he asked me a question and then broke down crying. And he said to me, my father was a pilot in this war, and he dropped the poison gas on your people. How do I ask for your forgiveness? And I wasn't sure how to answer that question, but I told him that maybe dialogue is the way to begin, and we were doing that. And he left and asked me not to leave the bookstore where I was, and he came back a few minutes later with a self-published book, and it was his father's journals, his father's diaries, and letters that he had written. And he gave those to me and said, do with it what you want. In those diaries, in the photographs, unfolded a completely different kind of war than what I had ever heard. And I began to think about the ways that soldiers might have preserved certain kinds of memories that could not be censored by the fascists. They were journals, they were photographs that they might develop after the war, or in a studio somewhere where the government wasn't looking. And so I started going to flea markets across Italy, and there's always a fascist table, which is another story. And from there, I started collecting journals, photo albums, letters, and that's when I started stumbling upon a line or two that a soldier would write and say, I shot at a woman today, or I think I saw a woman in a dress charging at us. And then I stumbled upon a photograph, and then at some point I looked back at all my research, and November 1935, New York Times is an article that says, in the headline, woman general leads 2,000 men into battle in Ethiopia. And it had been something that I had overlooked, seeking stories of men. And that changed the entire book.
Yeah, wow. I wanted to ask you about your process for collecting the photographs in Project 3541. Can you talk about, so you said you went to flea markets,
Yeah.
you identified the fascist table.
Yeah, they
And
were not
then?
always happy.
Yeah, I was going to say, I
They were
assume
not
they
always
weren't
happy to see
greeting
me.
you with open arms?
Yeah, they were, it depends. I would get two, and there literally is always a fascist table. It doesn't happen here in Germany, but across Italy, I would just go into a market and look for Mussolini's head, and that's really the direction where I would go. And they're still there. So I would get two different reactions, and one of them is saying, what are you looking for? They would recognize me as an East African, maybe, but if I asked for this, then the box would come out with photographs, and they would stand there often and help me look. and would just not leave and help me. But the other reaction that I would get is often, if I picked up something, I had more than one instance where they would grab the thing out of my hand and shove me away, or tell me that I couldn't afford anything at the table, so I needed to get away. So there are all these ways to deter me. But I often would go with an Italian friend of mine and tell them, you look. And that's how I would get these images. The images were often, what made me interested in these particular images was that they were different from what photojournalists were taking, especially photojournalists sent by Italy, as these are all working for Luce, all working for the Italian propaganda machine. And often the photographs that would get printed in newspapers were staged battles. The photographers would have to set something up. And so I knew that those things were not really the truth. And at the same time, Mussolini and the censors were very careful to keep the atrocities out of the front pages, to keep them clean, to create a narrative of Italians as la brava gente, as decent people, decent colonialists. And so you would have images of them building roads, building bridges, maybe in market, but never the real devastations. That was filtered out of the news. But the soldiers' photographs, they often came with cameras. The Weimar Republic revolutionized photography, and these handheld cameras. Suddenly everyone, not everyone, but a lot of people could afford that, and they took their cameras to war. This was for them a big African adventure. The photographs that they took told an entirely different story of war. There were, of course, stories of camaraderie, companionship, of going to market, of mingling with local people. But there were also these photographs that showed the real brutalities of what they did to people across East Africa. And then there were also, what I started finding was photograph after photograph after photograph of women and girls, of course, exploitative images. And one particular album that I've been struggling to write about for a number of years now. I'm still making new discoveries about this. But one particular album, which was an album of just women and girls in really exploitative images. What I have started to realize from that album is that the photographs that these men were taking were a way to, a way to curate their memories so that they could make themselves into the kinds of men that they imagined through the photographs that they made, so that they could go back home as different kinds of men, perhaps, more manly, more masculine in their mind. And these images that they made, the albums that they created, for me began to seem more like, it was almost as if I was walking into a gallery and walking through somebody's head and looking at the memories and beginning to understand the kind of person they wanted to imagine themselves in war. This particular album is one that has struck me, because I imagined, who is this man? What did he think about? Why was he doing this? And they're only pictures of women and girls, not anything else, not what actually happened in war. And so the women became coded language for many layers of violence that happened in that war. And so this is something I'm still working on. But these photographs have come to me through that. And of course, people have contacted me and shared photographs from their family members, and that has been an incredible and enlightening experience that's still ongoing.
And is that mostly Italian people or
No,
a mixture?
it's been a mixture. It's been surprising. I've had Italians send me photographs of grandparents or great uncles who were part of this war. What has been most interesting, though, in that is that mixed in with here are these images, I have also been getting questions such as, I know that my grandfather had a child.
Oh, wow.
Will you help me find my uncle? My family doesn't want to talk about this. Here's the location where he was stationed, and I can't do it. You know, I don't know how, but I get these requests which remind me that this war devastated more people than we think, that there is no war that doesn't ruin both sides in one way or another. And that's just one instance, but I have gotten other instances of Italians, but then people who eventually moved elsewhere, so now they are Swiss or now they're something else, asking for help in locating family members. I get the requests also from Ethiopians saying that their great uncle or someone had been sent to a concentration camp. There were many across Eritrea and Somalia, Ethiopia, wondering if I can help locate people who were disappeared. So those things are also part of this in a way that makes me think that I can't do this on my own. It's gotten pretty large. This history is all-encompassing. It affected soldiers from former British colonies. So I have conversations with Kenyans whose grandfathers were in this, Indians whose grandfathers, uncles were in this, Libyans. So this is something that is just much larger than these two countries.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I wanted to ask about how you think about kind of care and responsibility when you're building an archive that is it means so much to so many people. It has people's lives in, people's memories. And it sounds like you're getting even more responsibility thrust upon you.
I feel like they're real. I feel like these images are real people to me. In a way, for better or worse, I'm quite protective of them, especially the photographs of these women and girls. I'm very careful with where I show them or how I show them. I don't want to participate in a second exploitation of them. They still feel alive. They feel like my sisters. So I try to be careful. The photographs that families do share with me or do send to me, I'm really careful about that too, because I understand that these are lives. The war is over, but I think as we all know, just because a truce is called or a victory is declared, it doesn't mean that the war ends. That wars carry through generations. And 3 generations are really, I think, barely touching what actually happened. Because each generation learns to talk about different things. And in Ethiopia, it's been one thing on top of another, and we haven't fully addressed this one.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like both the book and Project 3541 seem to try and fill lots of the silences, the intentional omissions, the unintentional omissions that happen in this history. I mean, I was shocked to find out that the Italian government only admitted to using the gas in 1996, I think it was, a full 60 years after it happened. And I guess, I was wondering how does the reality of those omissions, when there's things like the government only admitted to it 60 years later, how does that affect your process and what you want to focus on?
Well, I think that the fact that the government only admitted and then they haven't even apologized yet. Let me say that. They admitted in '96 that they used poison gas. So what does that, it's interesting that that admission set off a series of events for researchers and writers like me. It had a profound impact because I think, and this is just my theory, that when the government admits something, it then creates the possibility that information and evidence exists. Before that, even if you have these documents, technically it doesn't exist because the government has not admitted it. So the minute it created that, yes, we did do this, then suddenly these archives that were quite literally in attics and in basements of libraries in Italy could come out of boxes and begin to be cataloged. And that changed, I think, the way that scholarship happened around this. It gave me the opportunity, several years later to go into Italy and start looking at archives about this, so that it created the opportunity for dialogue, but it hasn't fully reckoned with its history. And there's an absence of a kind of vocabulary that I think Germany has in its ability to talk about certain parts of its past, that I think the United States has in its ability to talk about its history of racial segregations and complete annihilations of Native American groups, slavery, and so on. There's a vocabulary, but that vocabulary has to consistently expand. Italy has not had that, and it makes a difference. It made my research a little bit difficult sometimes. I noticed what it meant for a country to not have that dialogue. And I went back to the United States, really appreciative of African Americans who have made life there bearable for me and other Black immigrants, because it would be very hard if they hadn't worked to create that space.
Yeah. I mean, I wanted to ask about, one of the things I love about The Shadow King is that how it embraces the complexity of war from all sides. You've got, you write about Selassie's experience, the photographer, Aster, Herut, the cook. And I was curious what it takes to get in the mind space of the Italians, the aggressors, the people who...
That was hard.
Yeah.
That was hard. That was really hard. I had to think of a way. Of creating Italian so that they weren't saying "Mamma mia" like every other page, or I had to think about how to complicate these characters in a way that I would imagine myself sitting in a room with Carlo Fucelli, and I would try to imagine what he would say to me. And every possibility would make me so uncomfortable that I would just close my notebook and step away for a minute. And I had to think about how I would render them in a way that would create dimension, because I think that it's very easy for us to think of cruelty as uncomplicated, unintelligent, a simplistic, dumb, stupid brutality. But I don't think that that's what most cruelty is. I think it's more complex, and that within someone who is cruel, there is a capacity for compassion. And I think that my task as a writer was to find those lines that some of these characters would not cross, no matter what. and Fucelli and Ettore, but particularly Fucelli and Kidane, actually, another cruel one, was really difficult for me. I had to sit with them for hours and days and weeks and write and write and write and write, trying to understand them, trying to understand what they feared the most, and then see if I could push into that in the writing. But it took a lot, because one thing I understood at some point, and it was a result of this man that I just told you about that I met in Italy, who had asked me how I could forgive him. When he cried, asking for forgiveness, the one thing I understood was I was witnessing a very difficult father-son relationship. That was what was standing in front of me. He didn't know how to negotiate his father's capacity for cruelty with love that he might have had, or obviously had, for his son. He couldn't make those two things work, and it was breaking him. And I think when I was watching him, it helped me think about the fact that all these men were loved, and they were capable of love. And so what I had to do was render both those acts of brutality, but also love, with Italians, but with Kidane, and these other characters also on the Ethiopian side who were quite cruel.
Yeah, I think that's an incredibly generous approach. I mean, showing such compassion in the face of such brutality it's hard.
But that's the work of a writer.
Yeah,
because
that's how you get a book like this.
I was talking with a friend of mine recently, a Colombian writer, and he said something that I have held to be true, is that history judges and novelists try to understand. And what I was trying to do was understand these seeds of cruelty, and what happens afterwards when people are alone with their fears. And eventually Carlo Fucelli and I made some kind of a truce, and he became one of the most interesting for me to write about.
Yeah. I'm curious, did spending time in Italy and meeting people like this man you've talked about, did that help you find some of that compassion for the Italians, or was it just everyone was like, it was hard to write about Kidane, it was hard to write about Fucelli?
It helped. It helped me because I was friends with people whose relatives had been in Ethiopia. I was friends with Eritreans. I was friends with Somali. I was friends with Libyans. And when we would sit around and have these discussions of family memories and family experiences, what kept coming out again and again were the ways that we of that third generation or fourth generation were still carrying the burdens of our families. And it helped me understand how complex all of this was, and the fact that none of this ever stops just because someone passes away. And what I would see with my friends is just, we could sit down and someone's telling me, I've never talked about this before. I've never understood why my grandfather did this, or why my grandmother was like this, or why my parents did this. And we shared something in common. And then, of course, you realize I made friends, Italian friends, who are like family to me now. And it helped break stereotypes. It really helped me feel like I could begin to approach this history with some level of comfort, if that's the right word, but at least some level of understanding, because I could see people in different ways. I don't think I could have written this book if I had done it from the United States.
Yeah, totally. I love what you said about just the family myths having things in common.
Yeah.
The silences probably also having something in common. I'm curious how you dug into understanding what was myth, what was story passed through family, and what was reality, and actually to what extent that really mattered when it came to writing the book or to understanding what happened.
That's a good question. I believed that almost everything I heard from my family was myth at some point, because no one spoke about what it really was like to be in a war. And being in a war, what I was learning from just the documents that I was going through is really boring most of the time. You're marching through terrain, you're marching, nothing happens. You are trying to survive. The food you're eating is not very good. You can't take injera, the Ethiopian food. Everything had to be dried. Everything, you may not have water for days. So life was different. There was also that sense of, I think, possibility that war brings, that everything is in upheaval, everything is changing, so everything is possible. And I think that had a profound was a profound thing for maybe some of the women who decided that they did want to fight. Maybe other people who were completely dissatisfied with the way that Ethiopia was structured and run. I think those possibilities mixed with all of the realities that war would bring, the battle, but the boredom and all of this was something I wanted to capture. But it's never something that I learned about. I mean, no one's going to tell you this when you're a kid.
Yeah, it's not the most compelling story.
No, and no one tells you the things they don't want to remember. So that was also something that I realized.
Yeah, and I presume you must have talked to your family about the war when you were preparing for this book. That's obviously something that can be very difficult. I think maybe as this was a bit further away in time, it's probably easier, but I'm curious if you faced barriers in getting people to talk about the war and how you overcame them.
I found that my family was often really happy to share stories of bravery, stories of defiance, the way that one uncle or someone else connected to our family outwitted Italians in one way or another. Those stories came readily, and those were stories that I heard. But it wasn't until I was finished writing this book, and I had begged my editor to give me about 3 more weeks so that I could rush to Ethiopia and go through some of the sites where I had written battles, just to make sure that I had the landscape correct from memory. And so I had the extension. I was going with my cousin on a 10-day trip through the countryside. We were going to just do a drive. I didn't want to fly anywhere. And my mother decided she would come along because she's often gone with me to these things and she loves it. And so we spent 10 days and talking about the book, talking about different sites, going into these small towns, talking with the local people. All along I'm talking about this book, which is done. And when I get back to Addis Ababa, we had just gotten back, and I mentioned to my mother a photograph that I have of a female soldier, and she looks at me as if I'm an idiot, and she says, "Well, what about your great-grandmother?" And I said, "What?" She said, "Well, your great-grandmother went to war." And I remember that feeling of just like, my God, I've been working on this for 10 years. I've done so many trips. I lived in Italy. I went into these archives. Why didn't you tell me this? And she said, you never asked. Oh, and so I didn't believe her. I just didn't believe that that was possible. So I called all my aunts, all her sisters, and I said, tell me the story. And I asked them separately. And they all came back with the same story.
What was their reason for not mentioning it before?
They just...
The same. Cool.
They just thought I knew, or my mother, it was her responsibility. I have no idea. But what it made me think about was, why didn't I know? Not why didn't I know, but why didn't I ask? I didn't ask because I had always assumed that history was in the archives, history was in documents, and history was spoken in places where men were. I mean, every time I heard a story, it was because somebody walked through our door, or somebody showing me a photograph of a great uncle, and they're saying, this person did this, and this person did this. And yet the story of my great-grandmother was shared in a space where only women gather. She told her daughters, and her daughters told their daughters. In the kitchens, in the bedrooms, in the spaces at dinner parties where women go separate from the men, and the men discuss history, and the women tell women's stories. I had not realized or thought that those women's stories were history also. So now I have learned my lesson, and I'm asking all the time. I'm asking my family, what haven't you told me? What else is there? And the one thing I do say and ask is, I would say to all of you to go back to your families and ask someone, what haven't you told me? And see what comes up. I have done this before, and I have had actually a friend of mine come back to me and say, I had no idea my great-aunt fought in the war. And so these family stories only get revealed when you say, okay, tell me something you haven't told me, and then you see what comes up.
Wow. And how did finding out that your great-grandmother was one of these women affect the book?
Well, it was too late to change it. Oh. So I had already asked for an extension. This book was way too long and getting done anyway. But there was something really uncanny that I realized. My character, Hirut, is a young woman, young girl, who fights, her father's gun is taken away at the beginning of the book, and that gun it's a mission for her to get her gun back. And she does everything that she can to get that rifle back. My great-grandmother's story was that as a young girl, she had been in a marriage, an arranged marriage. She was much too young to live with an adult man, so she still lived at home. When the war was coming, there was a mobilization call. The elder of every family, take your father's gun or take your gun and go to war, the eldest child. She was the eldest child. She had 3 younger brothers. Her father said to her, I'm going to give the gun to your husband, and he'll go in our name. And she said, no, he won't. She didn't like him very much anyway. Later they divorced. But she didn't like him. She said, that's my gun. That's not his gun. Her father gave the gun to the man. And my great-aunt took her father to court and pled her case and won. And got her father's gun and went to enlist. And the parallel between Hirut's story and my great-grandmother was something that struck me, and in fact shocks me even now. It has made me think in quite concrete terms, what gets passed down to us that we might call creativity or we might call imagination. We've had doctors now talk about cell memory and all of these things, but is there a way that things from our relatives, our ancestors, still live in us, and they are so much a part of us we don't even know it? But I've had these conversations with friends of mine who are writers, and this is not the first time that something like this has happened. It's an interesting and ongoing conversation that I'm still having.
Wow, that's incredible that there's that parallel.
Yeah, I was really, really shocked.
Yeah, I was just about to ask, do you think there's some part of you that actually knew that this is what happened, that you were drawn to that part of the story, that you were drawn to?
I don't remember. That's the thing. And my editor, in the marketing of marketers and publishing, jumped on this, and they said, "Oh, we can say it's inspired by your great-grandmother." I said, "No, you cannot. You cannot." It's something I learned after the fact, and I made clear about that at the end of the book. But who knows where inspiration comes from?
Yeah. I mean, I guess related to this, I noticed that in lots of reviews, the Shadow King's described as being about female resistance and female war heroes. But for me in the book, what you did was an incredible job of acknowledging complexity of the heroes, that you can be good and bad, you can do brutality and experience love. And I think that's especially true with Aster. I mean, just the opening passage that you read out. Can you talk a little bit about how you developed her character just as an example of someone who can be so cruel and yet such a leader and just did so much?
Yeah, Aster's cruelty is also, it's connected to her leadership, I think. I did not want to create a story of women who rose up, worked together without any kind of reality, right, or complexity, created a unified front and fought the enemy all for the same reasons. That's what we get in movies. We get that in these superhero movies. But I wanted to create these characters that had more depth to them than that. And Aster I found very interesting because I don't think she's a nice person necessarily. She's a woman that is wants to raise an army, not because she wants to change. She's not doing it necessarily in the name of justice, let me say that. She is fighting because she wants to lead an army. If her husband is doing it, why can't she? She is working with Hirut, who is her maid, for all intents and purposes, is really like an enslaved person. But she's not fighting for a better world for Hirut. She's fighting to maintain the kind of hierarchy that puts her and keeps her above people that she thinks are below her, like Hirut. But Aster has her own demons, has her own history, has her own pains that she is trying to grapple with at the same time as she's trying to lead an army. All of that makes her both angry and compassionate, but that anger is what makes her also a leader and completely unafraid of facing Italians, and eventually completely unafraid of standing up against Carlo Fucelli. Hirut is somebody else that is trying to upend and turn her life around, using this war as an excuse to create and make herself into something else. When Aster tells her, "You're less than the dirt in my fingernail," Hirut imagines, well, I'm a soldier, so let me be a soldier, let me do something. So there are these tensions between them. I won't say too much about what happens later, but I wanted to explore that because I really, just because a woman is fighting out in a war, it does not mean that that side is the moral and just side. But I didn't want also to have a woman who is a saint or a woman who is absolutely demonic. And, angry women are not demonic women. Every woman is entitled to her anger. Every woman is entitled to her ambitions. And I wanted to render a character like that.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that complexity. On kind of the other side of the characters that you write about, you've got Selassie, who, I don't know, you were imagining, he has such a legacy, or people know about him. I mean, he's an actual figure, obviously. I'm wondering if you felt any pressure when you were portraying him and the things from his perspective, given the historical narrative about him, and how you decided how to portray him as a character. I mean, he doesn't come across as the boldest leader, I'll say, as he flees the country and hides in his country house.
Yeah. I was not going to have him in this book. This was going to be and is a book about memory, about what we carry with us. I wanted to start this book in the home and see what happens as war creeps in, what happens to relationships, what happens to what people want to remember and carry forward. And then I discovered, along the way of researching this, I discovered Zanaborg, who was a child of Haile Selassie, a daughter, and she had been given in marriage to a man who was about twice her age. And I think she married quite young, maybe 12 or something, and was sent away. And very soon, she was sending panicked messages back to her parents, saying, please bring me back. They're not treating me well. But he had arranged this marriage with a rival family so that he could keep his enemies close, and so this young girl was a bargaining chip, basically. It didn't work because that husband ended up being one of the first collaborators with the Italians. But Zanaborg, after 2 years, died, and there was never any mention of her in the history books that I would come across. I only stumbled on one photograph of her before the marriage. There was never a reference to her. And I began to wonder about a father who would do that to his daughter, even after panicked messages, not saying enough, let's bring her home. And what kind of leader then does that man who is a father become? And because I wanted to start this book in the home, the first scene is in a home with Aster and Kidane. I said, we'll begin in his home, but I'm going to bring Zanaborg alive. I'm going to make her live, and let's see what she might have to say to him. So this is how he ended up creeping back into this book. Yeah.
I like that. I like that even he came through the women.
Yes. Yeah.
In this book. I've just realised it's almost 10 o'clock.
Wow.
That sped by. And I don't want to be greedy and take up all the question time with Maaza. Are there any questions from the audience about the topics that we've been talking about today? Yes, please. Sorry, do we have a microphone for? Yeah, fantastic. Sorry, thank you.
I just wanted to ask if you talk to younger people in Italy about the war, because I always made the experience that they didn't know about it. You know, like when I told them about Eritrea or Ethiopia. So that's my question: if you talk to younger people, or
Yeah, thank you for that question. I did talk to young people. They don't know about it. They do not know about it. And so this history is just not, as you know, it's just not taught in textbooks. There is a lot of work happening right now in Italy to discuss this history. This book comes out, it came out in Italy maybe a year ago, I don't remember, but I owe so much credit to Italians who are working to make this history known, to people like Gabriella Garmandi and Ijaba Shaggo, who are Uba, who is a beautiful writer, Italian and Somali. There are writers who have been doing this, and my book joins them in conversation and doing their work. Their work has made this book possible, but no, they do not learn this. The kids are not learning, but I hope, considering the way that Italy is going, I hope that this history gets taught.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Hi, good evening. Thank you so much for the book. I really loved it. It's one of my favorite books that I've read in the past few years.
Thank you.
You talked earlier about how within your family, the men would gather and talk about history, and the women would gather and talk about women's stories. I was wondering, because in the book also, towards the end of the book, there's a line, sorry, I read it 2 years ago, so I can't really remember exactly, but there's a line, something along the lines of, women contributed so much to the resistance and to fighting the Italians, like they will always be remembered, something along those lines. And yet, fast forward a few decades, and that's completely not the case. You talked about how that operated kind of at the household level. I wondered whether you could reflect a bit on how kind of the national narrative in the public spaces and at the national level around the resistance and the war against Italian occupation developed, and the contribution to nation building, and how that also led to an erasure of women's contributions and women's realities.
I can, thank you for that question. Maybe I can give you the example of my great-grandmother as a way to answer some of what I think you're saying. Someone once asked me, what would you ask your great-grandmother if she were still alive and you could ask her anything? And I think my answer to that was, I would ask her what it felt like to go from being a soldier to coming back to the house and being somebody's wife. And I think that is an answer to part of what you're asking, which is about the erasure of some of these stories. That women were soldiers on the battlefield, but the minute they left that battlefield, they became something else again. When the war ended, they moved back there was no other role for them. They moved back into the home to do the things that they had always done. Those stories eventually got silenced because everyone talked about was what men did. I live in the United States. I go back and forth to Ethiopia. I know that there are celebrations that honor patriots, people who fought. I know that there are women who are part of that. I don't know if people actually understand how many women were active. I spoke recently with a historian who's written a book about warfare in Ethiopia, and I asked her, how many women do you think? I said, what, like 500? 1,000? And she looked at me and she said, there were thousands everywhere. And that's what tells me there's still so many stories out there to write.
Thank you for the question. Do we have anyone else who has a question for Maaza? I mean, I'm curious, are you still in touch with that Italian, the first one who gave you his father's, I think it was, journals and everything that set you on this path at all?
I
or-
kept in touch with him for a while.
Yeah?
And then not. I mean, the book took me 10 years to write. So I was in touch with him. There's so many of these stories, but it's funny that you're saying that, because recently I came across that book again in my pile of research books, and I thought I really should reach out to him because he had a really profound impact on me.
Yeah. And I guess one last question on the photographs. Was there any particular album or set of photos that set you on a particular direction within the book? Like I'm thinking about the photographer here, the photos that he describes, were any of them inspired by real photographs or?
Yeah, they were. A lot of the photographs that I describe, they are either the exact image that I own or very, very similar to it. I've seen these photographs. Yeah, so they did get referenced in here. There were times when the only way that I could actually look at a photograph I had been trying to avoid was to say, okay, you have to write about this now. And then that would be the real reason that I would have to look at it. And then I've put a lot of them away and I can't look at them.
Yeah, I can imagine.
There's a question back there.
Oh, yeah, please. Oh, can you just wait for the... Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. I have a question for you. I am Italian, and my grandfather was in the war in Ethiopia, and I discovered that few years ago. And I didn't have the time to ask him because he died earlier. And but in my family, my father, my uncles, my aunt never asked him anything about the war. So he never spoke about it. So my question for you is, do you blame more? Actually, it's a question that I asked to myself. Do you blame more the people, the Italians that they were on war, or Italians that never ask a question about it?
Oh.
Because sometimes I don't know. That's I don't have an answer to that, but I would like to. I'm curious about your answer to that question. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I have a friend of mine whose uncle went to war. She did not know it until we had been friends for almost 5-6 years. She is a historian who studies this and had no idea. It's because she mentioned to her mother about some of the research that I was doing, and her mother said, let me show you your uncle's album. She'd never known. The one thing she came back to me with is my mother said, her mother, because it was her brother that went to war, said when her brother came back, he never spoke about this, which we find again and again, like you were saying. Her mother said Ethiopia was a wall in our family. I don't know how you would break that kind of wall. You have to know the kinds of questions to ask. But if a nation has never spoken the truth about what happened, how do you know what kinds of questions you're supposed to ask? These men came back from the war in 1941, and then soon after, the Nazis were in Italy. This system devours its own. It always will. It went from Libya into Ethiopia, it was in Eritrea, Somalia, and then it just moved right into Italy and kept chewing. It destroyed people, and I think at some point there was no time for questions. Questions, I think, are a luxury sometimes. But we have time now. There are generations that I think that have passed. We have the time now to ask. But Italy has never given people a vocabulary. South Africa has had its Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Rwanda has had its confrontations with the past. The Americans have had constant, continual, ongoing conversations about racism, the civil rights movement. We're still far from being done, but it's happening. Germany has had its constant negotiations with its history. Imagine if that never happened, and that's what Italy is right now. And you see it in the far right. You see it with Berlusconi. You see it with the way migrants, refugees are treated. There's no vocabulary to combat the racism. So I don't blame a new generation. I blame the country that has still to apologize.
Okay, thank you for that. Yeah, no,
Thank you.
yeah.
Thank you.
I guess just to wrap up, one final question. I heard a rumor that the Shadow King might be made into a film. Can you say anything about that, or is that?
Oh my God! I don't
is that a
know.
really
I don't know if
awful
it,
question?
no. I don't know how much is a secret.
This is being live streamed.
Is it?
Yeah, I think so.
No, they're
Don't
not.
say
They're
anything
not
about
watching.
Okay. You don't know that. No.
It is being made into a film. I think we're getting closer and closer. There is a script. I'm really excited about that. I think the part of the reason I think it's taken a little while to do this is that there is a good problem in Hollywood right now, in that every Black actor is busy. They're working on films. So I'm happy about that, but
Excellent.
that's what's kind of
great.
making this a little bit slower. But I'm excited, and I'm really excited about the direction that the film is going, that they're really, really trying to honor the complexities here. And so we'll see what happens, but no one email me if you don't like it later.
All right. Thank you so much for your generosity this evening and for
Thank
talking
you.
to us and
Oh,
for
there's
coming,
one more
everyone.
question.
I'm going for that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was great.
Aw,
Thank
sweet.
you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. All right.
Put this on?
Yeah, I guess so. That's great. Thank you. Yeah, so